By the time esoteric knowledge reaches the masses and the public, it gets diluted and distorted, especially the most scariest concepts in all of Esoterica. So today, I'm going to be explaining the symbolism and the esoteric meaning of 666. So one of the most important things that we have to understand when it comes to numbers and esoteric symbology is that esoteric meanings always convey more than one thing. But even though esoteric symbology and esoteric meanings and knowledge are pointing to the deepest layer of a concept or term or meaning, there are still different extensions or different other layers of that concept's meaning. So basically, there's going to be more than one meaning to any esoteric symbology. And it's up to us to be able to understand and learn every layer of it, but also to know that there's duality embedded within this reality. So, especially when it comes to 666. For instance, in numerology and in the tarot, 666 represents some sort of balance or a seeking of balance. So there's a seeking of harmony or transitioning to harmony. And a transitioning to harmony implies already that there's some sort of balance, either that we're trying to have reached, some sort of internal equilibrium in order to gain harmony, or one that we have already reached. Now, that would be at the surface level, I would call that, when it comes to 666. Because in numerology, the reason why 666 is being represented as seeking balance and seeking harmony is because 666 is also, in numerology, pointing to 9. And the number 9 is one number of completion. So 9 means completion. Now, in other branches of numerology, that's not always the case, but it does mean completion. So when we're talking now about 666 being equal to 9, in numerology, 666 representing ultimately 9, we think that 666 means balance, harmony, completion. But that's not the case because things aren't always that easy in Esoterica. What 666 represents is the parts. It represents the parts to assemble to become 9. And when we're in the parts that are not yet assembled, that are not yet unified to become 9, that would mean it's not complete yet. And that just so happens to be what the 666 esoteric symbology at its deepest meaning means. It means incompletion, or if we want to get super technical, at the heart of 666 is base consciousness. 666 means base consciousness. So what does base consciousness mean? Base consciousness is another way of saying lead in alchemy, or base consciousness is known as animal consciousness, beast consciousness. That's why it's known as the mark of the beast. It's because without the sensationalizing of it, without the religious impositions on it, when you pull back all of that, what beast really means when it comes to the mark of the beast and 666 is that it's animal consciousness. No offense to animals, love animals. Animal consciousness, because it is base consciousness. It is the opposite of unity consciousness. Base meaning the most lowest level. So base consciousness is what 666 truly means. It means it's an incomplete process. The great work of alchemy has not fully transmuted the lead into gold yet, or into unity consciousness. So unity consciousness or enlightenment would be the completion of that process, the completion of the great work. And so 666 is representing incompletion, man in its half state, in its base lower state of consciousness, and it has not completed the process into enlightenment, into unity consciousness. This also tracks with Gematria, which is numerology, still just the deepest mysticism of numerology, where Gematria completion is portrayed as 777. And then we also have in the tarot and then in other branches of mysticism 10 being completion. So you have 9 being completion, and that's absolutely valid. And then you have 10 also being a signification of completion. And then, as I said, in Gematria, you have 777 representing completion, God consciousness. It is the state of completion, of fulfillment of the work. And so 7 is a deeply esoteric number that always signifies fullness. There's a fullness. That's why in esoteric texts, there's a lot of references to the number 7. 7 years or 7 days, or there's sevens. It's not an actual 7 days or 7 years or whatever have you. 7 is an esoteric signification of fullness. So numbers do mean things. I know sometimes we either like to have a completely fear-based consciousness where we give all of our power and all of our sovereignty away to symbology and to numbers, or we like to completely dismiss any esoteric meaning or any type of archetypal powers that numbers hold. But in duality, like how we are right now, since we're in a reality that's dual, we're going to have positive and negative symbology represented within one concept. And when it comes to 666, it's not something we need to be afraid of. And it does, as I said, reference balance. It represents seeking harmony or transitioning to harmony. And it even represents carbon-based life. And carbon-based life is still known in Esoterica as base consciousness. So Esoterica is no chill. In esoteric knowledge, they equate 666, meaning carbon-based life form, or lead, or base consciousness, with being in an alchemical journey, in an alchemical process, but one that is incomplete yet. And reaching that fulfillment, going through that process of the great work into reaching unity consciousness or enlightenment would signify some form of crystallization happening, which is why carbon-based life form, once it's gone through the alchemy, turns into crystallization, crystalline. Now, there's nothing wrong with carbon-based life form. I'm just explaining the esoteric meaning behind that. Now we can shift over to why Mark of the Beast in 666 turned into religious sensational phenomenon. And that's because when we involve prophecy into any type of esoteric knowledge that then gets passed down, the prophecy gets so distorted that by the time it goes through generation after generation, and then it goes into larger and larger layers of the public, things are bound to get distorted, just like a game of telephone. And so it got turned into a control and fear mechanism. Now, the fact that 666 at its deepest symbolism represents base consciousness is a little amusing when now we're in base consciousness, afraid of something outside making us go into base consciousness, but we're already in it. So there is a lot of prophecy that purposely gets implanted so that we as a collective start to believe the most fundamental version of that prophecy, or the most fundamental, the most base level of a belief, the most base level of some form of phenomenon. And that's almost an oxymoron, because to remove ourselves from base consciousness, we have to enter into unity consciousness. And so if we're in a state of incompletion, or if we're in a state of base consciousness, and we're afraid of something base consciousness external, thinking that we're not already in base consciousness, that's just the blind leading the blind. So base consciousness is something that we have to become aware of first in order for us to transmute or go through that alchemical process of unity consciousness. In this case, that would be first understanding the esoteric terminology of these things, because the religious and the sensational parts of this knowledge is completely distorted. Even the book of Revelations is not what it was turned into. It was meant to be a standalone piece, and it was the last book to get canonized because it wasn't supposed to be in the context of the Bible that it was. It was specifically a whole book about going through the alchemical process, going through the spiritual evolution within the body-mind into enlightenment or into God consciousness. So it was a manual or a reciting of that process. And so base consciousness in this sense is when you have cut off your higher centers, your higher spiritual centers, and you are only operating from your base energy centers. So your lower self, you're only in base consciousness, meaning you're operating fully from the lower centers known as ego. So you're in egoic consciousness. Another way to say this is you're in fundamentalism. And I'm not saying fundamentalism just in a political way or just in a religious way. We need to really understand fundamentalism as a way of the consciousness being conditioned to perceive everything, because that fundamentalism is known as base consciousness. It's known as separation consciousness. It's known as, well, for me, I call it calcification. There's just ways that the lower consciousness, when it's not connected to the higher self, when it's not connected to the higher spiritual centers, starts operating from the lowest form of perception, and that is base consciousness. So when we're looking at 666 in both its beautiful way of striving for balance, if not already in balance, or 666 seeking harmony, we could also look at that as being in harmony with the negative attribute of 666. Or I wouldn't even say negative, I would just say the state of 666, which is base consciousness. We don't have to think of base consciousness as negative or a carbon-based life form as negative, as long as we know that it's not complete and it's going through that process, it's going through a balancing to come into enlightenment, to come into unity consciousness. So now that I've laid out the different meanings of 666, now where is the truth in there being some form of mark in the external realm, in our reality, that's trying to get us to continue operating in base consciousness? What would be in the external realm that's trying to disconnect us from our higher self, disconnect us from our spiritual higher centers? Well, I will leave that to your imagination, but there are such things. I just don't want all of the stuff that has to do with the external ways and methods and inventions that are cutting off our consciousness's link to our higher self. I don't want that to get the most spotlight, because that's already getting a lot of spotlight, and frankly, from many different groups that are in base consciousness. So once again, it's like, okay, well, we're aware of the external threats. We're aware of the external enemies sometimes without being aware of our own predicament and our own consciousness. In my video, The Difference Between Densities and Dimensions, I talk about how we are in the third density. And the third density specifically has the most free will, because we are in both animal or base consciousness as well as our spiritual centers. So we're both spiritual man and animal man. In esoteric terminology, that's what we would call it. And so we're the conjunction point. We're the point where the lower levels of reality and the higher levels of reality meet. They intersect here in the third density. And because of that, we ourselves have a fluidity with our own nature. Our own nature isn't just animal or base consciousness, and our consciousness isn't strictly just spiritual. It's not even oriented towards the spiritual. We are here in the meeting point of all the different elements and where earth and heavens intersect. So because of that, we are pulled in different parts of consciousness. We're not just only in one center. We're not just in only one part of our consciousness. We're not just ego, and we're not just spirit. So 666 would represent the base consciousness within our experience of this density, the third density. So when we're coming from base consciousness, we're basically being pulled into the lower parts of this reality. And I don't mean the physical realm, because there's nothing wrong with the physical realm. I'm talking about the lower parts of our consciousness and how our consciousness relates to this reality. Because we can relate to this reality very conscious or aware and very loving and what have you. Or we can relate to this density and to our consciousness here through very egoic ways of seeing the world, very us versus them, or very separate. So it's the unawakened state. That's how we start off here. We start off in base consciousness, and then we're meant to have all of these different influences in the third density vie for our growth or vie for our attention. So here, that's why we have the most free will, because we don't have to evolve. Evolution is not an automatic. It is not a given. But we have a lot of universal forces, energy, and pressure to evolve. And that process to evolve in the third density is one where we're going out of animal base consciousness into the unity consciousness of the awakened being, of the sovereign. So this density has to do with sovereignty. Spiritual sovereignty is the deepest lesson embedded within this human experience. And what sovereignty means in this case is going from a being in base consciousness that was completely identified with the ego, that was not aware, was in complete separation consciousness, and then we go through the process of becoming aware, of growing, of evolving, and then now we are awakened enough, right? Because we don't have to be fully awakened. We can only awaken to the capacity of this experience. And there's things that we won't know unless we're in a higher density, and that's fine. But we awaken to the capacity of this density. And when we're doing that, we become sovereign. Sovereignty means that we have clarity and discernment about the nature of this reality. So that doesn't mean the nature of all reality, but the nature of this reality. And that spiritual sovereignty means we are no longer programmed, we are no longer dependent on external belief systems to tell us what being moral is, or to tell us whatever it is that we're dependent on. Spiritual sovereignty means that we now have the clarity and the discernment that comes with being enlightened. And the clarity and discernment that comes with being enlightened means that we're not programmed anymore. So base consciousness, it also is meaning that it's the programmed consciousness. It's the one that has not deprogrammed itself, then transmuted itself, then healed and purified itself into unity consciousness or into enlightenment. I hope this has connected you with your higher centers. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for higher dimensional guidance through spiritual awakening. See you next time.